In this electronic lab, we will be talking about the dural faults and dural sinuses. بداية, the brain is surrounded by 3 layers of meninges. The outermost layer is called dura mater, and the dura mater has 2 parts. The outer part of the dura mater is called periosteal layer, which is the periosteum of the cranial bones. And the inner layer of dura mater is called meningeal layer. The true dura mater separates from the periosteal layer to form dural faults. The first dural fault is called falx cerebri. It separates the right and the left cerebral hemispheres. The second dural fault, it's a horizontal fault, and it separates the occipital lobes of the brain from the cerebellum. This fault is called tentorium cerebelli. It forms a tent overlying the cerebellum. The third fault runs here. It separates the 2 cerebellar hemispheres, and it's called falx cerebelli. It lies here in between the 2 cerebellar hemispheres. The fourth fault lies here, overlying the sella torsica, and it separates the cerebrum from the pituitary gland. This fault is called diaphragma sellae. Starting with falx cerebri, it's sickle in shape. That's why it's called falx. Cerebri, it separates the 2 cerebral hemispheres. It has upper attached margin and lower free margin. The upper attached margin is attached here to the inner aspect of the vault of the skull. Anteriorly, the falx cerebri is attached to crista galli and the frontal crest, and posteriorly it's attached to the superior surface of tentorium cerebelli. Tentorium cerebelli, from superior aspect, it appears as semilunar in shape. It has outer attached border and inner free border. The tentorium cerebelli is attached here to the inner aspect of the occipital bone, superior border of the petrous part of temporal bone, and here to the posterior clinoid processes, like this. Inner aspect of occipital bone, the superior border of petrous bone, and the posterior clinoid processes. The inner free margin of the tentorium cerebelli is free. It forms this notch, the tentorial notch, for the passage of the brain stem, and the free border extends anteriorly to be attached to the anterior clinoid processes of the sphenoid bone. Falx cerebelli, it's attached here to the internal occipital crest. It runs between the internal occipital protuberance and here the border of foramen magnum. Diaphragma sellae is attached to the 4 clinoid processes of the sphenoid bone, the 2 anterior and the 2 posterior clinoid processes. And as you can see here, this dural fold roofs over the pituitary gland, and in the middle we have opening for the infundibulum or the stalk of pituitary gland. To summarize, we have 2 vertical dural faults and 2 horizontal dural faults. Falx cerebri, separating the 2 cerebral hemispheres. Falx cerebelli, separating the 2 cerebellar hemispheres. Tentorium cerebelli, separating the occipital lobes from the cerebellar hemispheres. At the sites where the meningeal layer of the dura separates from the periosteal layer to form these dural faults, we have spaces filled with venous blood, and these spaces are called dural venous sinuses. The first dural venous sinus runs here in the superior border of falx cerebri, and it's in a sagittal direction, so it's called superior sagittal sinus. The other sinus runs here in the inferior border of falx cerebri, and it's called inferior sagittal sinus. Here at the junction between the falx cerebri and the tentorium cerebelli, we have sinus. This is straight sinus. Along the attached border of tentorium cerebelli, we have also sinuses. Between the tentorium cerebelli and the inner aspect of the occipital bone, we have transverse sinus. Along this border, the attached border of tentorium cerebelli and the petrous part of temporal bone, we have superior petrosal sinus. So here is the location of the superior petrosal sinus. And also here at this junction between the petrous part and the occipital bone, we have here sulcus or fissure for inferior petrosal sinus. The transverse sinus here unites with the superior petrosal sinus to form sigmoid sinus, which runs in this groove, sigmoid groove, and then it passes through jugular foramen to become internal jugular vein. Superior sagittal sinus, it runs in the upper attached border of falx cerebri, and it grooves the interior aspect of the skull vault to form superior sagittal sinus groove, here in blue. Not shown here, along the inferior border of falx cerebri, we have inferior sagittal sinus, which unites with another vein here, deep cerebral vein, to form here in green the straight sinus. As you can see here, the superior sagittal sinus at the level of the internal occipital protuberance curves to the right side to form right transverse sinus. The right transverse sinus unites with the superior sagittal sinus to form right sigmoid sinus. The right sigmoid sinus runs in this groove, then it passes through the jugular foramen to form internal jugular vein. The right internal jugular vein here in yellow. Now, the straight sinus, here at the side of internal occipital protuberance, usually it curves to the left side to form left transverse sinus, which again unites with the left superior petrosal sinus to form the left sigmoid sinus, which passes again through the jugular foramen to become left internal jugular vein here in green. So both internal jugular veins are simply continuation of sigmoid sinuses. Now here at the base of the skull, we can see the different dural sinuses, starting with this sinus here, which runs along the lesser wing of sphenoid. This sinus extends here to the parietal bone, so it's called sphenoparietal sinus. So here in blue, sphenoparietal sinuses. At the sides of the body of sphenoid, we have the cavernous sinuses. At the superior border of petrous part of temporal bone here in green, superior petrosal sinus. At the base of the petrous part of temporal bone, or the inferior border of the petrous part, we have inferior petrosal sinus. And as you can see, the inferior petrosal sinus, the jugular foramen, and then it drains into the internal jugular vein just outside the cranial cavity. The superior petrosal sinus unites with the transverse sinus here in orange to form the sigmoid sinus here in brown, which passes through the jugular foramen and continues as internal jugular vein. Also here we have sinus along the attached border of falx cerebelli. This is occipital sinus. The meeting point of the superior sagittal sinus, the straight sinus, the two transverse sinuses, and the occipital sinus is called confluence of sinuses. It's located along the internal occipital protuberance. The most important sinus clinically is the cavernous sinus, because it has many communications with many sinuses. The first communication here anteriorly, the sphenoparietal sinuses open into the anterior part of cavernous sinus. Also here through the superior orbital fissure, the ophthalmic veins drain into cavernous sinuses. The cavernous sinuses are also connected by these sinuses In red, the intercavernous sinuses. Then the blood flow from the cavernous sinuses posteriorly to drain into superior and inferior petrosal sinuses. If we remove the left cerebral hemisphere, you can see here falx cerebri. Along its upper attached margin, the superior sagittal sinus, and along the area of junction between the falx cerebri and tentorium cerebelli, this is straight sinus. The meeting point here at the internal occipital protuberance is the confluence of sinuses. The base of the skull showing anterior cranial fossa, middle cranial fossa, and here posterior cranial fossa. This tough layer is the dura mater, the meningeal layer of dura mater. Again here, the cranial cavity from inside, the meningeal layer of dura. It's tough, it's white in color. And here is the horizontal fold, tentorium cerebelli, separating the occipital lobes from the cerebellum.